This summer, as many of you know who have been in worship a lot, you know that we're going through the parables this summer. And sometimes those parables are encouraging and comforting. I got to preach on the lost sheep and the lost coin the last time I was in this pulpit and give that encouraging word that we are pursued by God. Some of the parables give a word of warning. And all of the parables, as all of Scripture does together, give a complete picture of what we need to know for the Christian life. So today's today's parable, is a word of warning to some extent. So hear now these words from Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I've made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Are you sure? There were once 2 girls waiting anxiously, as many kids do, to find out who their 4th grade teacher would be. A few weeks before the school year began, cards were sent in the mail revealing this important information. Kimberly, the first girl, saw her teacher's name and almost started to cry. Her brother had him. And he said, Oh no, you are in for it. That teacher is really strict. Kimberly's brother explained that he had a highly developed merit and demerit system and would write students' name on the board if they were misbehaving in some way. The public humiliation method, keeping kids in line. Even students who had gotten straight A's up to that point would be put in their place. This man had been teaching so long, her brother said, that he hardly ever smiled. He was burned out on kids. Kimberly's mom was no help. "It's good to have different types of teachers," she said. "The year can be a lesson in getting along with difficult people." Shauna was the other girl, and she saw her new teacher's name on the card and couldn't believe her luck. Her sister had had this teacher, and she said that no teacher loved science more than he did. And Shauna was a science nut. This teacher kept a highly organized classroom, her sister said. Kids knew his expectations, and so time wasn't wasted on silly discipline issues. According to Shauna's sister, this guy loved his job, delighted in kids, was one of the best teachers on the staff. Shauna couldn't wait. As the year got underway, Kimberly was so afraid of upsetting her teacher that she kept her head down and her mouth closed. She personally didn't get in trouble, but she didn't have any fun either. The rumors she found out were true. Shauna, on the other hand, had never felt so gung-ho about learning before. She and her teacher got along famously. He made science come alive like no teacher before him, but he also happened to be good at teaching reading and writing and math. He made her want to be a teacher. Shauna's sister had told the truth. This guy deserved an award. And the funny thing was, can you guess? Kimberly and Shauna had the same teacher. Preconceived notions have a way of shaping our experiences. Today's parable is about preconceived notions and the consequence of those ideas. A master goes away for an extended period of time and entrusts 3 servants with his wealth, something that would have never been done between a master and servants, to entrust servants with wealth with no instructions. Unheard of. Now, a talent here is not a special gift like a musical ability or an intelligence. It's money. It's a lot of money. 1 talent is about 15 years' wages. The master gives 1 servant 5 talents, another servant 2 talents, and a third servant 1 talent, trusting that those servants knew him well enough to make good decisions on his behalf when he was gone. The first 2 servants immediately get to work and double the money they've been given. They have the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge mentality of just going for it. But the third servant digs a hole and hides the money in the ground. Why? Because he had a preconceived notion of this master. When the master returns, he says, "I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering seed where you did not scatter. I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground." Not surprisingly, the master is upset. There was no justification for this kind of assumption about him. The third servant had been entrusted with 15 years' wages. And so the master says these words, "You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then at least you could have put the money in the bank." He throws this third servant into the outer darkness at that point, which seems harsh. But you could say that the third servant already lived in a darkness of his own making. He simply continued to live there. What are our perceptions about God? What are the primary images we carry? Do we see God primarily as gracious and generous, or as harsh and demanding? Do we see God as detached from human suffering, Or is God moved by it and somehow involved? Because the way we think about God, our preconceived notions about how God relates to humanity, shapes our experience. It affects how we live our lives. It influences what we do with the gospel. When I was growing up in the 80s, televangelists were in their heyday. I couldn't have named it then, but looking back on some of their teaching, I can see a theological assumption that guided many of them. It goes like this: God is just. If you obey God, you will be rewarded with prosperity, including perhaps a Cadillac. If you disobey, you will be punished with disease, humiliation, or financial ruin, you name it. In fact, when 9/11 happened, some of these same televangelists said that God was punishing the sins of the people in New York City. Same thing was said about Katrina and the victims there. I cannot deny that this theological assumption of disobedience leading to punishment can be found in areas or places in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament, sorry. It's there. But is it central to what we now believe as Christians? Thank goodness no. There are other theological assumptions that slip into our way of thinking. These assumptions often come out when we start talking about hot topics in the church, and notice that we do not all see it the same way. The problem in these conversations is that our theological center, our primary understanding of God, often differs. One person might see God as demanding moral righteousness. Another person may believe that God created everyone in God's image and is basically good. Still another sees God as standing for the poor and the marginalized no matter what. Sometimes these assumptions that we carry are based on more on who we are than on who God is. We tend to project onto God what we believe about ourselves. That's what happened, I think, to the third servant. He was driven by fear, and he ended up accusing his master of the same. He was tight-fisted in his mentality, and he believed the same about his master, even though his master had entrusted him with this lavish sum. So how can we be sure that our perceptions about God are not so self-constructed and off base that we don't end up digging a hole and living forever in our own darkness? Matthew, the writer of this gospel, would say that the true picture of God is right in front of us. He would say that the church's true theological center is a person and not an abstract idea or moral code. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, fully revealed God with us. In the book of Matthew, Jesus taught radical religious integrity, compassion for the lost and vulnerable, mercy for sinners. And like the other gospel writers, Matthew saw Jesus' death and resurrection as the most revealing thing about the character of God. In those events, Jesus showed us God's willingness to enter into the suffering of others, rather than to stand at a safe distance and offer words of correction. Jesus revealed the profound generosity of God, the God who created us. Jesus alone is our theological center, the lens through which we interpret all of Scripture, even those passages in the Old Testament that sound so harsh. And perhaps it even helps us interpret this passage in Matthew that ends so harshly. The televangelists I remember from my childhood need to have looked no further than the suffering, self-sacrificing Jesus to be set free from the traps of greed in which they were caught. Believing in a generous, compassionate, forgiving God opens us to living the gospel in a way that is far greater than anything we could come up with ourselves. If we understand God to be fundamentally generous, we will be generous in the way we give our time and treasure. If we see God to be fundamentally compassionate, we will see purpose in visiting a lonely aunt, bringing soup to a sick neighbor, listening to the point of view of another with whom we disagree. If we view God as ultimately forgiving in nature, we will open our arms to a brother or sister who has hurt us. Like Shauna, the girl who believed the best about her teacher. Like the two servants who go out and do something with the money they've been given. We end up receiving far more than what we bargained for. In the last book of the Chronicle of Narnia series, The Last Battle, C.S. Lewis describes heaven like a vast, beautiful country. The children are standing before the door of heaven, and all is well. The last battle has been won. But they see, huddled in a little corner almost, a corner, this circle of dwarves talking to each other. Now, back in Narnia, dwarves had been very stubborn, negative people, or creatures. The children try to get them, get up, venture further into this beautiful country that's opened up. But the dwarves refuse. In fact, they cannot see or smell that there is sky and trees and flowers around them. They are absolutely convinced that they are sitting in a dark, smoky stable and can't see a thing. Then Aslan comes, and the children ask Aslan to do something for these dwarves. Aslan speaks to them, the dwarves, in a low growl, but they think it's the sound of their enemies, and they huddle more closely in fear. He produces a feast for them, miraculously, but they can't taste its goodness, and they end up in a brawl with each other. Finally, Aslan says to the children, "You see, they will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is only in their own minds, yet they are in that prison, and so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out. But come, children, I have other work to do." He went to the door, and they all followed him. He raised his head and roared, "It is time." Then louder, "Time." Then so loud it could have shaken the stars, "Time." The doors flew open. We end up getting the God we believe in. What kind of God is that for you?